So first of all, I actually don't know how old you both were when you first met Francis Bacon. Did you know about him before as a painter or as a friend of your father's?
I can't remember. I I um, I had I don't have a sense of having met him or being surprised when he appeared. Um, yeah, he was just one of the he was one of the people in the background when I met my dad. Yeah. Yeah, the Colony Club, particularly, he was one of those people who was a kind of an intense energy, and people were always having worthy discussions and drunk worthy discussions, and Francis was the centre of them, I think.
I started going there when I was 12, rather embarrassingly, because I could remember walking down the stairs thinking, I'm 12 years old, I've had 3 Pernots, I'm quite drunk, but I can do this. I didn't think, what terrible parenting, or what are these people getting me into? So that's when I started. I suppose that's when I became aware of him. But it wasn't all these famous people, because we didn't know that. And so it was just our dad and his friends. And if in the context of us living with mum having 5 illegitimate children, living in dire poverty, and us being taken up the West End by our dad in either a Bentley or some other stonking fancy car, and then having amazing times and food particularly. And then so Francis was part of that whole, the glamour of Soho from the perspective of a very impoverished little child, really.
I remember Mum having electricity cut off and her telling me not to get money from Dad, who would lose 10 grand in a casino in 5 minutes. But I think that I was much younger when I went to the Colony. I remember being given handfuls of sixpences to play the fruit machine. I think that I was taken there when he did that first picture of us when we were 7 or 8, 6, 7 or 8. I remember going there, and I'm always surprised to remember that I've actually went out with Dad quite a lot. I mean, I think of him as this absent parent, but then it's interspersed with all these adventures. So, but they both seem true. But we went to the Colony up this narrow staircase. There was always Muriel Belcher on her stool at the beginning of the bar. Calling everyone darling. She loved Francis.
Calling everyone darling, calling everyone cunty. That's what I remember being 12 and hearing her saying to everyone, oh, hello, cunty, and thinking, oh, I didn't know that was even a thing.
But I remember her calling everyone darling. I remember her and Francis, and I remember, I remember her being, She was proud. She was proud of her clientele, I think. Oh, I loved the. It was an adventure. It was like going to a party. That's what it was. It was like going to a wild grown-ups party. And you go to the Wheelers and have I'd still potted shrimps every time I see them on a menu anywhere. I go back to the Wheelers in my heart.
And the raspberries, and then they used to come round with a soup tureen and a soup ladle of cream, and the cream was yellow as opposed to cream in Islington, which was white. And then they come round with this thing and then give you a great big spoonful of this yellow cream on your raspberries. We always used to have that.
And I still,
it's so good.
And one of my one birthday many years later, when I was going through my blue period and I hadn't seen anyone for a while, and I mean, I was in a really bad way, and I stumbled down, got up in the afternoon and came down to my front door, and there was a bucket of lobsters on my doorstep, which Dad had left there, and that was to do with, that was to do with our childhood and Wheelers and connection in those days, and
Anyway, we can't think of anything more to say about Francis, but we can talk about Dad for hours.
I remember him just being so permanently drunk. The idea that he managed to...
I didn't even notice he was drunk.
I remember him always being so drunk and so sort of out of control. The idea of him managing to create this body of work, I couldn't see I couldn't see how that happened. I couldn't see how this this ball of insane kind of he was, you know, he was. Yeah, he was debauched. He was debauched. Francis Bacon was how he. So and I got the feeling that just every so often he pulled himself together, threw some stuff on a canvas, and occasionally one would work, and then he could go back to drinking again for I don't know
Well,
if
maybe he painted every morning and then got out of his head for the rest of the time, and then got up again and started again.
I got the feeling that it was no, he'd have months of drinking and then weeks of working and then months of
I didn't
drinking.
realise that.
That was the sense that I had, but I don't claim to know. As the years have gone by, he's become larger, so it's really hard to make him the right size that he was then. But I think I had a sense that he was special to Dad. I remember getting taken to his studio once, and this is because I had about 3 or 4 things that I was. I think, oh, I must remember to say this. But I remember getting taken to his studio, and I remember Dad's studio was wild and covered in paint, but Francis's was next level. Do you know what I mean? He had this waste paper basket that was just so, it was, you know, quadruple the thickness and drip. It was a piece of art in itself. I remember that. And I had this one, and I was trying to kind of give it who asked the question or why he said that, but I remember because Dad painted so meticulously and every little bit was just considered on its own merit and revalued and started again if necessary. And I remember Francis saying about the way he worked, and he said, I just throw things wildly at the canvas, and every so often one of them works. And I remember him saying that, and I just remember thinking, this is just so different. The contrast couldn't have been greater. I remember that.
You could feel the tension because obviously Dad had in some way looked down on people that painted from photographs, there was always the feeling of this is totally inauthentic and everything's got to be authentic, and you've got to have a real life person in front of you, or a real tree, or a real something. And so that there was that, in a way, was his way of looking back on it. It feels as if that tension that was between them, of Francis being quite a lot older and him, I think, being very much part of Dad's education. I think Dad dealt with it in some way by having, this is how I do it, and having a slight feeling that was even more authentic than what Francis was doing. Although I went to Paris with Dad when Francis had a show there in, I think it might have been 1977, and that was the feeling of Francis's achievement was incredible, and there was no sense, we had gone there in a way to be part of Francis's worship, and there wasn't any feeling of tension between them or Dad disparaging anything, and it was just walking around the gallery looking at the paintings and the paintings being so incredible. And that one of the first times in my life I'd had that it was the fanciest thing I'd ever come across. There were endless, enormous parties, tiny little dinners in very swish apartments in Paris, and all these different social occasions, one after the other, where Francis was like a film star and everyone was worshipping him. And that was the first time I'd really been part of some circus like that. I think I thought he was Dad's best friend, and looking back on it, some of the things that Dad was interested in, well, gambling, I blame that on Francis, that must have come from somewhere, but who knows, because both of Dad's brothers also gambled. But the gambling was something that I could imagine Dad being introduced to by Francis. And Nietzsche as well, that I can remember even when I was a teenager, when Dad was reading Nietzsche, and I was thinking, but it's so adolescent, even when I was an adolescent myself. And I feel that was one of the things I remember so much from going to Wheeler's and going to supper with Francis, but being with Dad, and then how much this sort of scintillating energy that they had. They'd probably been painting a lot during the day, and they were having such a good time and so pleased with themselves, not in a horrible way, but in a really feeling, we're the thing, we are it. And that was such an extreme the extreme feeling of their excitement.
I was going to say one of my other memories was at Wheeler's, and which was, God, I used to love going to Wheeler's. It was and sitting at a table with Dad, and up at the bar on a stool was Francis, and all of a sudden Francis just keeled over and fell flat on the floor off his stool onto his back, drunk, and the waiters they kind of swooped and almost caught him and just put, as like a team of them, and just moved them back onto his seat just to try and retain his dignity and pretend it hadn't happened. It was, and I remember thinking that was quite a show.
When I was a punk, so there was me in Wheelers with Dad, and I had very, very short spiky hair and bondage trousers on. I worked in seditionaries on Saturdays, that was my Saturday job, and not that many people got it, and not that many people realised I was a girl as well. You'll find that hard to believe looking at me now. But no, there was a while when I just did get mistaken for a boy a lot. And then I was in Wheelers with Dad, and I can remember Francis like looking at, with the bondage trousers, you had like a strap round each knee, and then so your legs were joined together, and you could tighten it so that it made you slightly restrict how the stride, so you could walk. It would make you walk a bit funny, or you could just have the strap slightly dangling, so it was indicating that you had your legs tied together, but you didn't actually. And then also the very short spiky hair. And I can remember Francis like really realizing this was a new thing, and he did love the idea of things being new, and that he wanted to know, and it was a bit fetishistic, and I was a bit androgynous. There wasn't such a thing as gender fluid in those days, so maybe I was a tomboy, I don't know. And Francis being really fascinated by looking at how the whole thing was put together, and then saying, "Is it okay if I touch your hair?" and rubbing his hand on my hair and going, "Oh, I really like that," and that sort of thing. And then, but for having interest from an adult, not the kind of interest, the unwanted interest you get when you're a teenager, and particularly in those days when any interest from an adult basically was some perv being pervy, but Francis being genuinely interested in me as a human being and how I chose to dress, which was in a way how I was expressing whatever it was I was expressing. I don't quite know what, I probably didn't know what then, but having him being real, I remember thinking, yeah, I like this. I felt sort of amazing that he'd noticed me and not had, that was just able to not think this is Lucian's daughter and she's like this, but actually properly focus on me and who I was in myself. And that was very good. That was a very good feeling. I've got a really good photograph of me with my spiky hair. And I was in New York, and I met Andy Warhol. I think I met him at Studio 54, The Way You Do. And I was a teenager, and he asked me to marry him, not that we'd had a long or sexual or any type of relationship whatsoever, but more a relationship where he said to the bouncers at Studio 54, "See this girl, whenever she wants to come, just let her in for nothing. She's one of my guests." So I could go there whenever I wanted, which was so instead of having to queue up and be like discarded on account of having the wrong hair, I could just go to the front of the queue and get in. Anyway, so he did, and he drew this wedding ring on my finger and signed it. And then I went, I didn't have a camera. No, I did have a camera, but I didn't have a camera. I didn't know how to photograph myself with this thing. So I went up the top of the World Trade Center where there was a photo booth, and I took a photograph of myself, like a Polaroid in the photo booth with my hand, with my Andy Warhol wedding ring on it. And that would be a good photo to have in the film because of my hair. And also, obviously, I can show off about my Andy Warhol proposal.
Well done for getting that in.
I was working out how to fit that in all along.
I didn't think art was anything special. I just thought it's what everybody did. I know I didn't. So I had never had a sense of, it was only later when I looked at Francis's pictures and I thought, these are quite, these aren't bad, these are good.
When I went to that show in Paris, that's when I felt very influenced by them, very, very excited. And I think they did have quite a big influence on me, but in quite a bourgeois way, because the thing that when I first got this house, which was in the early 1990s, I can remember really strongly looking back at those paintings, not actually looking them up, but looking back at them in my mind with the red staircases and the green and things. And a lot of the way that this house was done up then was very like that. And I think that just to have the feeling of these interiors with red and green, that affected me for some reason really, really strongly. And I've slightly stuck with that. So I'd say that my colour scheme was one of my biggest things that I got from Francis, my signature. I do feel like, I'm sure everyone says this, but then some of them are, I think I was aware of some of them being really good and some of them not being really good. It reminds me of when I was at UCL and we had a seminar on Emily Dickinson, and the teacher, called Danny Carlin, read out 10 Emily Dickinson poems, and we had to say which ones were good and which ones were bad. And I can remember thinking at the time, oh, Dad's always going on about there are absolutes, and never being quite sure who the person was who was going to decide on the absolutes, obviously him. But a bit like that with Francis, and it made me think of that his work made me think of that. And sometimes you look at one of his paintings and it's just Francis doing a Francis Bacon and didn't have any quality or any amazing quality. And then other ones you felt that something almost like magic had happened, that it was so strong and so powerful. When you see one of his paintings of Dad, the body on those paintings is all the body of Francis, and there's this slightly plump, curved shoulders and buttocks, and even the kneecaps are slightly curvaceous. The whole thing of, I think, what used to be called Queenie, I don't know whether it is anymore, but I think Francis was probably one of the first people that I'd known who, I think it was the first time that I was aware of a man in our immediate circle being Queenie, and the connection between everything being curvaceous and Francis, the way that Francis walked with his buttocks and everything was a bit jiggly, and that made a really big impression on me. And if you look at every single painting that Francis has ever done of Dad, I don't think there's one where it's actually Dad's masculine body. In all the paintings, it's Francis's. There's every elbow and shoulder is a little bit plump and a little bit curvaceous, and that's an odd thing that you would do a portrait of somebody and always make them yourself in a way. But maybe that was just the practicalities of painting, and that Dad was probably not going to sit for more than 10 seconds, and so he then just did himself
the
instead.
Hypocrisy, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember,
when the boot was on the other foot.
I remember, I mean, the whole thing about I remember Dad telling me about Giacometti coming to London and him taking Giacometti round Soho, and the thing about, you know, the colony and everyone being so queer, and Dad saying that Giacometti had said to him, he said to me, if ever I come back, I think I want to come back as queer. They're having so much fun. Is what it was only long after I can't even, that Dad and Francis had stopped seeing each other, that I began to sort of think about the significance of the relationship and him. I thought everyone knew this, and when I mentioned it to Rose, I was quite surprised that it wasn't common knowledge. But I remember Dad telling me about Francis being famously queer and drunk, that he had boyfriends and that hit him, and that's what he liked. And I think that once it had Francis had, he looked worse for wear. He looked bashed up, and Dad decided that it wasn't okay, and tried to intervene. He interfered in Francis's love life to try and, it's like, I don't know. He tried to warn him off. I don't know. It's hard to know whether Dad was certainly capable of hitting people, and if not threatening them. But Dad tried to. He intervened with Francis's boyfriend to stop him from hitting him, and Francis didn't forgive him for that.
That's such a humiliating thing to have happened, isn't it, really? If you were Francis and that's what you liked.
I mean, I hope I'm not. I mean, I know that it was Dad that intervened. I don't know to what level he intervened. I'm just, but
But even if he didn't do anything to the boyfriend, if he just said to Frances, "You shouldn't. What you're doing is bad," then that would be enough.
Odd because Dad, Dad allowed people. He was, he expected people to have their strange, the strange parts of them, and so I was. I think it must have been quite extreme for Dad to have felt the need to intervene, because he was, people's private lives were private, and that was important to him. So it's surprising that he did. But so I don't think Dad blamed Frances for his reaction, or he just said, this happened, I did it, and that was, and this, and we, that was the end. Yeah.
But you can imagine how having Dad being judgmental about your behaviour, being someone that was, his own behaviour wasn't exactly immaculate, that could make you feel really humiliated, I think. It was horrible, Dad falling out with Frances. It was really horrible. It felt like a stupid mistake, and neither of them knew how to get off their high horse or work out how to put it back together again. And so there would be these people in Dad's life who were then slightly in our life, so that you'd go around there and there'd be somebody, and then they just wouldn't be there anymore, and you'd never see them again. But it was horrible.
But it was usually Dad who cut people out.
Yeah.
And it had happened the other way around. I think I never heard Dad speak of regret. I remember. And I mean, just to do with other conversations, I remember Dad saying, "There's no such thing as, I once to apologise for something I'd done," and he said, "It's nice of you to say, but it doesn't work like that. There's no such thing as free will. People just do what they have to do." Which is, it's, it justifies everything from anybody, doesn't it? Just thinking about it now, it felt Frances's disappearance was a weight, was a loss. Yeah, it was. There's a sadness about their closeness and it's an odd word to use around Dad, either giving or receiving, but support.
I love the one that was in Dad's bedroom.
Dad used to call it the buggers, didn't he? It was the biggest thing Dad had on his wall until the end. It was splendid and regal and significant and was the point of the room, where Dad lived and where he died. He died next to being looked on by the bug. Yeah. He died with the buggers by his side.
Nothing was mundane. Everything was incredibly scintillating all the time, in a way that when you're an adolescent, everything's like that. And then when you get older, some of the gloss comes off things. But it's somehow both Dad and Frances and Frank and Mike Andrews and others, they managed to have this incredibly high octane way of looking at everything all the time.
Bruce
so
Bernard was
everything was incredibly exciting to them. So you could see them feeling incredibly excited by everything around them, themselves, each other, and just that was something that you could grow up and feel, I could harness that, or wanting to just having that feeling and being around them, and then going home and being on your own and thinking, I can do something. They made everything seem incredibly potential, and the combination of Dad and Frances with their different ages and their different cultures and their different way of being, but the way that they sparked off each other and just the sheer love that they had for one another was so extreme. You just never seen grown-ups thinking, when you see two people talking and one's waiting for the other one to stop talking so the other one can say something. They were both really focused on listening to each other and sparking off each other, and so it did feel like that Dad really loved him and he really loved Dad, and that was a really great thing to see as a child.